Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. My name is Junior Ramírez-Cruz. I'm from the University of Luxembourg, and this is the video presentation for the paper Active Re-Identification Attacks on Periodically Released Dynamic Social Graphs. This paper is co-authored by Xihui Chen, Këpuska, and Sjouke Mauw, also from the University of Luxembourg, and is part of Project PRIVDA, which is funded by Luxembourg's National Research Fund. In this talk, we will first give an overview of social graph publication with an emphasis in the scenario of a dynamic graph. Then we will go to the main topic of the talk, which is active re-identification attacks on periodically published graphs. Then we will describe the experiments that we conducted to support our findings, and finally, we will give our conclusions. Social graphs describe how people interact in many ways and in many scenarios. For example, in online social networks, via email, chat systems, and other environments. In a social graph, vertices represent persons or other entities, and edges represent relations between these entities. Additionally, both the edges and the vertices may have attributes. Social graph publication enables a number of studies, either in the social sciences, marketing, etc. But it is always necessary to consider that the information contained in social networks is sensitive. The types of sensitive information that is maintained in social networks may include the identity of the nodes, which is itself sensitive, for example, in dating apps, where some individuals may prefer that it is not known that they're members of the network. The node attributes, of course, are also sensitive in some cases, like the ones that have to do with the address, religious beliefs, and the related sensitive information. And the relations between vertices may also be sensitive, depending on the type of relations that they represent. For this reason, social graphs must be sanitized before publication. This sanitization consists typically in removing node IDs and uniquely identifying information, and assigning pseudonyms to the nodes, which are uninformative by nature. And additionally, it may also involve some modification of the node set and the edge set to satisfy some privacy properties. When the graphs are published, the adversaries will try to re-identify the users, which is known as re-identification attacks. In a re-identification attack, the adversary tries to unambiguously re-identify users in such a way that they learn additional information about them. For example, in this small graph that we show, the fact that these two users in red are re-identified allows to know, for example, that they're friends. Re-identification is conducted because some users have unique structural properties, such as their degrees, or by comparing the sanitized graph with some auxiliary graph, or by interacting with the original social network before publication, as we will be the focus of this presentation. The attacks where the adversary does not interact with the network before publication are called passive attacks. And in this case, the adversary relies on public information, for example, the number of friends, to re-identify the users. In an active attack, on the other hand, the adversary first interacts with the network, for example, by inserting fake accounts, and these fake accounts are used to create unique fingerprints that allow to re-identify the individuals. Social graphs are inherently dynamic, and moreover, some analysis tasks require that this dynamicity is taken into account. For example, it's necessary to track users to know how their relations evolve over time and so on. If we want to conduct some analysis like community evolution analysis, dynamic link prediction, link persistence analysis, and so on. In these cases, we need the data holder to publish a data set that reflects dynamicity, usually by publishing a sequence of snapshots from the underlying dynamic graph. And we also need the pseudonyms given to the nodes in this sequence of snapshots to be persistent in such a way that this analysis task can be conducted. And this is the scenario where we focus in this talk. When we published a dynamic social graph, there are additional sources of information for the adversary. The knowledge that is available to the adversary increases over time, every time there is a new release. Also, new types of information is available. For example, we know the first and last time that where a user is present or where a pseudonym is used. But in the literature, there are considerably few works that address the privacy risk in this scenario. And the ones that deal with dynamic social graphs usually focus on passive attacks. So the way in which active adversaries may profit from periodical publication remain unexplored. Because of this, the main contribution of this paper is that we formulate for the first time active re-identification in the scenario of periodically released dynamic social graphs with persistent node IDs. In particular, we describe an instance of a new attack which is based on what we call temporal structural patterns for re-identification, and we show via some experiments that this new attack is at least 2 times more effective than the strongest active attack on static graphs reported in the literature, and at least 11 times faster. So we will explain how active re-identification attacks work, first focusing on the static scenario. In the static scenario, we have, as we can see in item A in this figure, a social graph, and the adversary will insert some Sybil nodes and will create unique connection patterns among the Sybil nodes and between the Sybil nodes and some legitimate users that we call the victims. When the data owner publishes the anonymized graph, she replaces all of the IDs for pseudonyms, including the ones for the Sybil nodes. Then the task of the adversary is to re-identify the victims, usually in a two-step process. In the first step, she will re-identify the Sybil nodes, and then she will use this information to re-identify the victims, as we can see in item D in this figure, where E and F are finally re-identified, and the fact that there is a link between them is discovered. When we are in a periodic release scenario, what changes is that all of these steps do not occur a single time. We will have a set of Sybil nodes that may evolve over time, both the connections between the Sybils and the fingerprints. The set of victims can also change. We can target different victims in different snapshots. And all of this information can be leveraged by the adversary. So re-identification will not be tried only once. The adversary, every time a new snapshot is released, not only will be able to conduct re-identification, that snapshot will also be able to refine the results of re-identification in previous snapshots. So to summarize our new attack, this attack is equivalent to Mauw static robust active attack, which is the strongest active attack known so far, in the fact that it uses a noise-tolerant search procedure to retrieve Sybil candidates by structural similarity, and it also uses a noise-tolerant procedure to match fingerprints. Then for the remaining snapshots, starting from the second onwards, our attack is different in the sense that it is able to use this temporal information. So we define what we call temporal consistency constraints, or TCCs, and these temporal consistency constraints allow us to reduce the search space, which speeds up the attack considerably, and it also reduces the uncertainty of the attacker. And then re-identification is not only conducted once on each snapshot, instead it is conducted as many times as needed in all snapshots released until the given moment. To see an example of how these temporal consistency constraints can be used to improve the attack, here we have the second snapshot in the figure that we used as example. In this figure, we can see that a static attacker would find two sets that are indistinguishable as candidates to be the Sybil set. We have W7, W1, or W6, W5. The subgraphs induced by these civil candidates and their neighbors are isomorphic, so the attacker doesn't know just by looking at this snapshot how to continue with the re-identification. So she has two choices, one which is incorrect and one which is correct. But once that the third snapshot is released, the attacker gains additional information. For example, we have that the vertex V4 is present in T2, but it's no longer present in T3. And the adversary is able to use that information to deduce that the re-identification given by X1, where the pseudonym assigned to V4 is W2, is not consistent because W2 continues to exist in T3, but whatever pseudonym was assigned to V4 is supposed to not be used in T3. That allows the adversary to deduce that X2 is the only valid candidate, and the re-identification deducible from X2 is then taken all over the set of the three snapshots. So we defined in general 4 temporal consistency constraints. 2 of them are used for discarding civil set candidates. We call them first used as civil and civil removal count. And 2 of them are used for discarding victim candidates. And we call them first time targeted and last time targeted. The intuition behind the first used as civil constraint is that for a set of pseudonyms to be a valid candidate as the set of civil nodes, we need that there is a mapping from each pseudonym to a civil node in such a way that the time where this pseudonym was first used coincides with the time where this civil node was introduced by the adversary. And these two elements are pieces of information that the adversary knows because it was the adversary who created the civil node, and the adversary always has access to all published snapshots. For the civil removal count temporal consistency constraint, what we check is that in a set of pseudonyms that we consider as candidates, the number of deletions, the number of pseudonyms that cease to exist from one snapshot to the next, must be the same as the number of civils that the adversary voluntarily removed from the graph for the match to be valid. Then for the first time targeted constraint, in this case what we do is that since the adversary decides when to target a victim, the time where each victim is targeted is used by the adversary to restrict the set of candidates for that victim. So any pseudonym that appeared in the releases in a time that is later to the first time that the victim was targeted, it is clear that this could not have been the pseudonym assigned to that victim, so it is rejected as a candidate. And a similar idea is used in the last time targeted constraint. In this case, there is one variation, and is that only victims that have already been targeted are considered in this for applying this constraint. And the reason is that for victims that were not targeted, we cannot be sure that the adversary knows when it was removed from the network, because the adversary may not even have been able to know that this user existed at all. For our evaluation, we use a collection of synthetic dynamic social graphs using a graph simulator that we built using the Barbasi-Albert model. In this simulator, we let a BA graph grow until it reaches a given number of vertices, and at that point we take the first snapshot. Then, for taking each consecutive snapshot, we let the BA graph grow until a given percentage of new edges has been added, and then we take a snapshot and so on. We also use for our evaluation two real-life graphs, Petster and Bitcoin OTC. Petster is a graph composed by pet owners, and Bitcoin OTC is composed by Bitcoin users and their trust relations. We apply a simple perturbation algorithm, which we call cumulative noise addition. So at every snapshot, an amount of noise is added cumulatively. That noise consists on edge flips, and the number of flips is controlled by a parameter that tells us what percentage of the number of edges is flipped. We compare our dynamic attack to Mauw et al.'s robust active attack, which is the so far strongest static active attack. Each attack is run independently on identical copies of each dynamic graph, and we compare these two attacks in terms of the success probability, the execution time. We additionally evaluate what factors have the largest influence on the performance of our dynamic attack and see how much these results extend to real-life graphs. First of all, from this graph, we can see that our dynamic attack is consistently more effective than the static attack, as can be seen in the top set of graphs. In the bottom set of graphs, what we can see is that our dynamic attack is also considerably more efficient than the static attack. And the reason is that the static attack, when applied at each snapshot, always has to analyze all possible candidates, and the number of candidates grows with the size of the snapshots. And this problem is not faced by the dynamic attack because the temporal consistency constraints allow it to discard the big majority of the candidates and remain efficient at all times. From this additional graph, first we can see that the dynamic attack is applicable on considerably larger graphs. We can see that here we can run it for graphs that start at 15,000 nodes, whereas from the previous graph, the largest graphs where we were able to run it started at 800 nodes only. From this chart, we can see that in addition to the amount of perturbation, which is expectably a factor that makes the re-identification risk decrease, the factor that is most important is how fast the graph grows between snapshots. So for larger values of the parameter ME, which is the one that controls how fast the graph grows, we get a faster decrease in the re-identification risk. And we also observe that the initial size of the graphs has a relatively small impact on the success probability. By looking at the real-life graphs, we can see that the finding that speed of growth among releases is the dominating factor on success probability also can be observed there, especially on Petster. You can see that between 2005 and 2006, there's a large, sharp amount of increase in the number of users, and that coincides with a sharp decrease in success probability for Petster. As conclusions, we have presented the first dynamic active re-identification attack on periodically released social graphs. This attack works by exploiting the inherently dynamic nature of social networks, leveraging temporal structural patterns. Our new attack is both more effective and more efficient than the alternative of repeatedly applying the best existing static active attack. We also conducted a preliminary study on the factors that dominate the success probability of the new attack, which gives us directions for future work, which is mostly about devising anonymization methods for the new scenario. We have in mind to develop two types of anonymization methods. The first one is based in incremental notions of some k-anonymity based properties, and the second one has to do with synthesizing dynamic graphs using privacy preserving generative models. So thank you for your attention, and we are open to any questions you may have.